Morning everyone. In this video today, the learning intention is to learn vocabulary and notation used in probability. This is our new topic in maths. For the next few weeks, we'll be talking about probability and all things to do with that. Our first step is to learn some of the new words you might encounter and some of the notation. And this word notation is the symbols and the different symbols we use in probability. To start with, I've drawn this line across my page. And I'm slowly going to fill this in and talk to it as I do it. I call this a scale of probability. At one end, I'll use left. I'm going to say all the way down this end, as far as you can go, is the word impossible. That represents everything. Down this end, it is impossible. And if you think about the opposite of impossible, all the way down the other end, I'm going to put the word certain. Sometimes you might hear the word sure. But if you think about these two words, they mean something. And in probability, they mean something really important. Impossible, we can represent that using a number. And the number is 0. If you think about how likely something is to happen, if you say it is impossible, it is going to happen 0 times. On the other hand, if something is certain of happening, we use the number 1. So when we talk about probability, we're talking about all the decimals or the fractions between 0 and 1. We can use, and we've learned about this in the past, you can use fractions, decimals, or percentages. So if something is impossible, it is 0, we might use the number 1. We may also use 100%. If something is certain to happen, it is 100% going to happen. If something is impossible to happen, it is 0% going to happen. So you could leave it as 0, you could call it 0%, they mean the same thing. Halfway between these, between 0 and 1, the number, you could have it as a fraction, 1 over 2, or a half. You could have it as a percentage, 50%. You could also have it as a decimal. As we know from what we've learnt in fractions, percentages, and decimals, these all represent the exact same amount. So you can use any of them. And in probability, we do use all of them. We most commonly use fractions. If I think about the word now, something that goes in between impossible, and certain, the word we often use is equally likely, or maybe it's called 50-50, or something along those, even chance. I'll use the word even chance. I quite like that. Or maybe it's 50-50, or maybe it's equally likely. But if it's bang down the middle, if something has an even chance of happening, it is 1 in 2 chance, it is 50% chance, or it is a 0.5 of a chance from happening. So they're the three main ones. In this realm here, if something has a better chance than half of happening, but it's not certain, you might use the word something like likely. Or perhaps it's probably or probable. But anything in this realm here is likely to happen. And it might be, if you use a number, anywhere between half and 1, or anywhere between 50% and 100% is likely to happen. On the other hand, if something is unlikely to happen, it's down here on my scale of probability. And it's anything from 0% chance of happening to 50% chance of happening, I would say is unlikely to happen. It's not impossible, it's not an even chance, but it's unlikely. I'm just going to label this my scale of probability. So where we're at now is you've learnt some new words in probability. Impossible and certain, likely, unlikely, and even chance. And there's other words you can fit in along this scale. They all mean something in probability, and you can represent each of these things using numbers, and in particular fractions, decimals, and percentages. I'll show you how. Here's my first example. And now we're going to talk a little bit more about the symbols and notation that we use in probability. The example says the probability of flipping a coin and getting a heads is 1 in 2. And I think everybody is familiar with that, this example. I think most people will have flipped a coin before. There's a heads and a tails. Now, we could write this down, but mathematicians, and in maths, we generally get pretty lazy and we look for shortcuts all the time. And in probability, that's no different. And we write it. We use capital P for probability. Sometimes you use PR. They both mean the same thing. use a bracket. I might write the word heads, but I'll just put a capital H equals 1/2. If you read this out in English, it would read like this. The probability of getting a heads is 1/2, or equals 1/2. Isn't that a much nicer way to write things than having to write this whole sentence out? This means the exact same thing as that. We use brackets, and inside the brackets, this doesn't mean P multiplied by H. This actually just means the probability of getting an H, and the H stands for heads in this scenario, is 1/2. So I'll just note down what each of these words means. P is probability. Sometimes we use PR, but the P in this case is probability. H stands for heads. So I'll just note that down. It's really whatever we want to happen. We wanted to get a head, so we put the H in here. The 1 represents, and we use a new word called a favorable outcome. And what a favorable outcome means, in other words, is what we want to happen. I'm just going to write down little notes next to what each of these things mean so we can break it down a little bit. What we want to, very nice, happen. That's a favorable outcome. And the bottom two here is basically how many outcomes are there. It is the number of outcomes. We use a 2 because there's a heads and a tails. There are 2 outcomes, number of outcomes. There's a couple of new words here I used. The word outcome gets used in probability a lot. It is what can happen when you do an event. In this scenario, flipping a coin. This is called the event. What are we doing? We're doing the event. Getting a heads, I would say in this scenario, is the outcome. So there's a few new things there that we've just gone through. The probability of some event, of some scenario, in this case we're flipping a coin, and getting a heads, that's the outcome, is 1 in 2. We've written this in the following way. The probability of getting a heads equals 1/2. And the 1 is the favorable outcome, which is what we wanted to happen. In other words, getting a heads. How many ways can that happen? And the 2 on the bottom represents the number of outcomes. In this case, how many sides are there on the coin? There are 2 sides. So one of them is what we want, and there are 2 possible outcomes. So that's the end of this video. And what you've just covered is briefly some new words and vocabulary that we use in probability, a couple of new notation symbols, such as the brackets and how this all works together, and that's the end. Hope you enjoyed it.